There is a room you have been living in your entire life. You know every corner, every shadow, every crack in the ceiling. The walls are painted with your memories. The floor is worn smooth by the patterns of your daily routines. The door, well, you've stopped looking at the door. Perhaps you've forgotten it exists at all. This room is not made of wood or stone. It is constructed from something far more subtle, far more insidious. It is built from the thoughts you've been taught to think, the beliefs you've inherited like heirlooms, the fears that whisper in the dark corners of your consciousness. This room is your mind. And somewhere along the way, without quite realizing when or how, it stopped being a home and became a cage. Welcome. Welcome to a journey that will ask you to look at the architecture of your own consciousness with new eyes. What you are about to experience is not merely a discourse on psychology or philosophy, though we will walk through both territories. This is an expedition into the hidden geography of human awareness, into the mechanisms by which freedom becomes confinement, and consciousness becomes its own prison. The question we must begin with is not whether the mind can become a cage. The evidence of that truth surrounds us, in the epidemic of anxiety and depression, in the cycles of thought we cannot escape, in the behaviors we repeat despite knowing they harm us, in the prisons we build from our own neurons and synapses. The question is, how did we get locked inside? And more crucially, how do we find the key? Imagine for a moment that you are standing in a vast library. The shelves stretch endlessly in all directions, disappearing into shadow. Each book represents a thought pattern, a belief, a story you tell yourself about who you are. You've been reading the same handful of books your entire life, the same narratives, the same characters, the same tragic endings. But here's what you don't realize. You are not just the reader in this library. You are also the author. And you are the architect who designed the building itself. This is the paradox at the heart of human consciousness. We are simultaneously the prisoner and the jailer, the trapped and the trapper, the cage and the bird beating its wings against invisible bars. In the next 2 hours, we will descend together into the depths of this paradox. We will trace how the mind, this miraculous organ that has produced every work of art, every scientific breakthrough, every moment of human transcendence, can turn against itself and become an instrument of exquisite torture. We will explore the psychological mechanisms, the neurological patterns, and the philosophical dimensions of mental imprisonment. But more than that, we will walk the path that leads from captivity to liberation, not through some easy solution or quick fix, there are none, but through the slow, painful, beautiful process of awakening to the bars we've built and learning to dismantle them one by one. This is season 2 of our journey, the awakening. And awakening, as you will discover, is not a gentle process. It is the earthquake that shatters the foundation of everything you thought you knew about yourself. Consider the story of a woman I will call Sophia, though she is not one person, but a composite of thousands, perhaps millions, perhaps you. Sophia wakes each morning at 6:47 a.m., 7 minutes before her alarm. Her first thought, before her eyes even open, is a word: failure. It arrives unbidden, unwanted, yet utterly familiar. It is the opening line of a script she has been performing for so long, she no longer remembers auditioning for the role. She moves through her day in a series of carefully choreographed movements, each one designed to protect her from some unseen threat. She rehearses conversations before they happen, predicting every possible way they could go wrong. She checks her email 14 times an hour, scanning for evidence of disapproval or disappointment. She smiles when she doesn't want to, agrees when she wants to object, disappears when she wants to be seen. By the time night falls, she is exhausted, not from the work she has done, but from the invisible work of maintaining the walls of her cage. She lies in bed, and her mind begins its nightly ritual, the replay of every awkward moment, every perceived mistake, every way she failed to be enough. The thoughts circle like vultures, never landing, never leaving, just circling, circling, circling. Sophia is not mentally ill, at least not in any clinical sense. She is simply living inside the architecture of a mind that has learned to imprison itself. And if you're honest, truly honest, you'll recognize parts of her story in your own. The ancient Greeks had a word, psyche. It meant both mind and soul, breath and butterfly. They understood something we have forgotten, that the human mind is not a fixed thing, but a living, breathing, transforming entity. A butterfly can emerge from a cocoon, but it can also get trapped, wings pressed against silk walls, unable to break free. Carl Jung, the great explorer of the unconscious, once wrote, "The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek." But what happens when the cave itself becomes the prison? When the very act of looking inward feels like descending into a labyrinth with no exit? This is where we find ourselves in the 21st century, an age of unprecedented freedom and unprecedented psychological confinement. We have mapped the human genome, but we cannot map the terrain of our own emotional lives. We have built technologies that connect us to billions of people, yet we feel more isolated than ever. We have more knowledge at our fingertips than any generation in history, yet we seem to understand ourselves less and less. The mind has become a cage precisely because we have stopped understanding it as a dynamic, living system and started treating it as a machine, one that can malfunction, yes, but also one that should be controllable, predictable, optimizable. But the mind is not a machine. It is an ocean. It is a forest. It is a vast, mysterious wilderness that follows its own laws, harbors its own darkness, and holds its own untold treasures. In the ancient mystery traditions, initiates were brought into dark chambers and forced to confront their deepest fears. The Greeks called it katabasis, the descent. Every hero's journey includes this moment, the descent into the underworld, into the belly of the whale, into the darkest night of the soul. What we are undertaking together is a modern katabasis, a descent into the underworld of the mind itself, not to escape it, but to understand it, not to fix it, but to transform it, not to transcend it, but to integrate it. You might be wondering, why should I subject myself to this? Why explore the darkness when I could simply focus on the light? These are fair questions, and the answer is simple, though not easy. Because the darkness is already there. The cage is already built. The only question is whether you will remain unconscious of it, moving through life in automated patterns, or whether you will become conscious, painfully, beautifully conscious, and in that consciousness find the possibility of freedom. Friedrich Nietzsche, that prophet of psychological truth, wrote, "And when you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you." But what he didn't write, what can only be learned through the actual descent, is this. When you gaze long enough into the abyss, when you let the abyss gaze back, you begin to realize something extraordinary. The abyss is not separate from you. The abyss is you. And once you understand that, once you truly understand it, the nature of the cage begins to shift. We stand now at the threshold. Behind us lies the comfortable ignorance of unconsciousness. Ahead lies the challenging territory of awakening. The journey will take us through the history of how we came to understand and misunderstand the human mind. We will explore the mechanisms of mental imprisonment, from the neurological to the philosophical. We will descend into the darkest chambers of psychological collapse and ego death. And we will emerge, if we have the courage to complete the journey, transformed. The door to your cage has always been unlocked. You just haven't been able to see it because you've been looking in the wrong direction. You've been looking outward, at the world, at other people, at circumstances. But the door, like the cage itself, is internal. It exists in the architecture of your consciousness. Are you ready to see it? Are you ready to discover how you locked yourself in? Are you ready for the pain and the beauty of awakening? Then take a breath. Close your eyes for a moment. Feel the weight of your body, the rhythm of your breathing, the vast silence beneath your thoughts. And now, let us begin the descent. Every cage begins with a blueprint. Every prison requires an architect. To understand how the mind becomes a cage, we must first understand how the mind itself came to be understood, how we began to map the invisible terrain of consciousness, and how those maps became, in time, the very walls that confine us. Our story begins in Vienna, in the dying days of the 19th century. The city is a crucible of change, where the old certainties of empire and religion are cracking, and something new, something strange and unsettling, is emerging. In this atmosphere of intellectual upheaval, a young neurologist named Sigmund Freud makes a discovery that will change humanity's understanding of itself forever. Freud's discovery is not gentle, it is not comforting, it is this. Beneath the surface of your conscious mind, beneath the rational thoughts and deliberate choices you believe define you, there exists a vast underworld of unconscious forces, desires, fears, memories, urges, that shape your behavior in ways you cannot see and do not control. Imagine you are driving a car. You believe you are in control, your hands on the wheel, your foot on the pedal. But Freud reveals that there is someone else in the car with you, someone in the back seat, hidden, whose hands are also on the wheel, pulling it this way and that, influencing your direction in ways you attribute to your own free will. This hidden passenger is your unconscious mind. Freud called it the id, the cauldron of seething desires and primitive impulses that civilization requires you to suppress. He described the ego, the conscious self that mediates between the ID's demands and the external world's requirements, and he introduced the superego, the internalized voice of authority, morality, and social expectations that judges and punishes you from within. Here already we see the seeds of the cage. The ego, caught between the id's chaos and the superego's tyranny, between internal desire and external demand, becomes a battleground. And in this battle, patterns form. Defense mechanisms emerge, repressions calcify into structures. Think of a child who is punished for expressing anger. The anger doesn't disappear. It cannot, for it is energy, and energy cannot be destroyed. Instead, it goes underground, into the unconscious, where it festers and transforms. Years later, that child, now an adult, finds themselves unable to assert their needs, unable to speak up against injustice, unable to access their own healthy aggression. They experience this as a personal failing, a weakness of character. But it is actually a structural feature of their psychological architecture, a wall built long ago to protect them from punishment. This is how cages are born, not from malice but from protection, not from weakness but from adaptation. The mind, in its brilliant creativity, learns to imprison itself in order to survive. Freud's patients, mostly bourgeois women of Vienna, came to him with mysterious symptoms: paralysis with no physical cause, blindness that medicine could not explain, hysterical fits and fainting spells. The doctors called these women malingerers, attention seekers, weak. But Freud looked deeper. He saw that these symptoms were not random malfunctions, but meaningful communications. The body was speaking what the mind could not. The unconscious was finding expression through the only language available to it. One of Freud's early patients, Anna O., suffered from paralysis, hallucinations, and an inability to drink water despite terrible thirst. Through what Freud and his colleague Joseph Breuer called the talking cure, they discovered that each symptom traced back to a repressed memory, a moment of trauma that had been locked away in the unconscious. When Anna was able to remember and express these buried experiences, her symptoms disappeared. She had, in a sense, unlocked a door in the cage. But here is where the story becomes more complex. Because as psychoanalysis developed, as it spread across Europe and America, something else happened. The method designed to liberate the mind began, in some ways, to create new cages. The theories became dogmas, the maps became territories, the diagnostic categories, neurosis, hysteria, psychosis, became identities. People learn to interpret their experiences through Freudian frameworks, to see Oedipal complexes and penis envy where there might have been other explanations, other truths. This is a pattern we will see repeated. The tools we create to understand the mind become themselves structures that constrain it. But let us not get ahead of ourselves. Let us go deeper into the origins. In 1913, Carl Jung, once Freud's protégé and heir apparent, broke with his mentor and embarked on his own descent into the underworld. Jung called it his confrontation with the unconscious, and it was a period of intense psychological crisis that lasted several years. He experienced visions, heard voices, felt himself fragmenting. A lesser man might have retreated into madness. Jung did something different. He engaged with the visions. He dialogued with the inner figures that appeared to him. He painted them, wrote about them, gave them space to speak. And through this process, he made discoveries that would expand the map of the unconscious in radical new directions. Jung realized that beneath the personal unconscious, Freud had identified the repository of your individual repressed memories and forgotten experiences. There lay something even deeper, the collective unconscious. This was a layer of psyche shared by all humanity, populated by what Jung called archetypes, universal patterns and primordial images that appear in the myths, dreams, and religions of every culture. The hero, the shadow, the anima and animus, the wise old man, the great mother. These were not merely symbols, but living psychological forces, structures in the psyche that shape human experience across time and culture. And here, Jung discovered something crucial about the cage of the mind. We are imprisoned not only by our personal histories, but by collective patterns that far precede us. We are born into psychological structures that have been forming for millennia. The cage is both personal and transpersonal, individual and collective. Jung's most important contribution, the one that matters most for our journey, was his understanding of the shadow. The shadow is everything about yourself that you cannot accept, everything you judge as wrong or bad or unacceptable. It is the parts of your personality you've exiled into darkness. But here's the paradox. The more you repress the shadow, the stronger it becomes. The more you deny it, the more it controls you from the darkness. It manifests in projections. You see in others the qualities you refuse to see in yourself. It erupts in moments of overwhelming emotion. The rage that surprises you, the envy you feel ashamed of, the desires you thought you'd conquered. The shadow is a fundamental component of the mind's cage. We imprison parts of ourselves in order to maintain an image of who we believe we should be. But those imprisoned parts do not disappear. They rattle the bars. They seep through the cracks. And they take their revenge in symptoms, in sabotage, in the ways we mysteriously undermine our own happiness. Jung's insight was radical. The goal of psychological development is not to eliminate the shadow, but to integrate it, to bring the darkness into consciousness, to meet what you fear in yourself with curiosity rather than judgment. This process, which Jung called individuation, is the work of a lifetime. But we are still in the realm of origins, still tracing the architectural plans of the mental cage. Let us move forward in time to the mid-20th century, to another revolutionary insight. In the 1960s, a Scottish psychiatrist named R.D. Laing made an observation that scandalized his profession. He suggested that what psychiatry called mental illness might sometimes be a sane response to an insane world. That schizophrenia, rather than being merely a brain disorder, might be a desperate attempt by the psyche to deal with unbearable contradictions and impossibilities in the family and social environment. Laing described what he called double binds, situations where someone receives contradictory messages that cannot both be true but also cannot be questioned. A mother tells her child, "I love you," while her body language communicates disgust and rejection. The child's mind, trying to make sense of this impossible situation, begins to fracture. In Laing's view, the family itself could be a cage, a system of invisible rules, unspoken demands, and contradictory expectations that drive its members to madness. And mental illness, in this framework, was not a disease to be cured, but a message to be understood. Though Laing's theories fell out of favor, his insight remains profound. The mind does not exist in isolation. The cages we build inside ourselves are often replicas of the cages that surround us in our families, our cultures, our societies. Consider the woman who cannot leave an abusive relationship, not because she is stupid or weak, but because the cage was built in childhood, in a family where love was conditional on compliance, where anger was punished, where boundaries were violations. The cage she lives in now is so familiar it feels like home. Or consider the man who achieves every external marker of success, yet feels empty inside, because the cage was built from the expectations of parents who measured worth in accomplishments, who withheld approval until every goal was met, and then simply raised the bar higher. His mind has become a performance review that never ends. These are not metaphors. These are the literal structures of consciousness, the neurological patterns etched into the brain through repetition, through trauma, through adaptation. And this brings us to neuroscience, to the physical architecture of the mental cage. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, advances in brain imaging allowed scientists to peer into the living brain for the first time. What they discovered revolutionized our understanding of how the mind builds its prisons. The brain, it turns out, is extraordinarily plastic, constantly rewiring itself in response to experience. Every thought you think, every action you take, strengthens certain neural pathways and weakens others. The neurons that fire together, wire together. This is beautiful when it comes to learning skills, forming loving attachments, developing resilience. But it becomes terrifying when you realize it means that patterns of anxiety, depression, self-criticism, and fear can become literally hardwired into the structure of your brain. A person who experiences chronic stress, whether from trauma, poverty, discrimination, or toxic relationships, develops an overactive amygdala, the brain's alarm system, and an underactive prefrontal cortex, the center of rational thought and emotional regulation. Their brain becomes hypervigilant, constantly scanning for threats, unable to rest. The cage becomes neurological. Or consider the person with obsessive-compulsive disorder, whose brain gets stuck in loops, unable to move past certain thoughts or rituals. Brain scans show overactivity in specific circuits, particularly involving the orbitofrontal cortex and the caudate nucleus. The mind is literally trapped in its own feedback loops. This neuroscience reveals something crucial. The cage is not just psychological, but biological. Yet, and this is where hope enters, neuroplasticity works in both directions. The brain that wired itself into patterns of suffering can rewire itself into patterns of freedom. But this requires something specific, conscious, sustained, deliberate practice in new ways of being. Let us synthesize what we've discovered about the origins of the mental cage. From Freud, we learned that the unconscious mind shapes us in ways we cannot see, that repressions create internal conflicts, that early experiences form psychological structures. From Jung, we learned that we carry both personal and collective patterns, that the shadow must be integrated rather than denied, that individuation is the path to psychological freedom. From Laing and the systems thinkers, we learned that individual minds are embedded in larger systems, that cages are often built collaboratively, that what seems like personal pathology may be interpersonal reality. From neuroscience, we learned that psychological patterns have physical correlates, that the brain wires itself through experience, that both suffering and healing have a material dimension. But there is one more origin we must explore, perhaps the most fundamental of all. Long before Freud, before modern psychology, before neuroscience, there were philosophers who understood something essential about the mind's capacity to imprison itself. In ancient Greece, Plato told the allegory of the cave. Prisoners are chained in a cave since childhood, facing a wall. Behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, People carry objects that cast shadows on the wall. The prisoners, knowing nothing else, believe these shadows are reality. They are imprisoned not by chains alone, but by their mistaken beliefs about the nature of reality itself. One prisoner escapes, emerges into the sunlight, and sees the real world for the first time. The sun is blinding. The truth is painful. When he returns to the cave to free the others, they think he's mad. They prefer the comfort of familiar shadows to the shocking illumination of truth. This is the ultimate cage, the one built from our beliefs about reality. We mistake our interpretations for truth, our perceptions for reality, our thoughts for facts, and in doing so, we lock ourselves in prisons we don't even know exist. The Buddhist tradition identified this same insight 2,500 years ago. The second noble truth states that suffering arises from attachment and aversion, from the mind's tendency to cling to pleasant experiences and reject unpleasant ones. But beneath this, there is an even deeper cause, the illusion of the separate self. We believe we are a fixed, solid, permanent I, an entity that moves through time, that has experiences, that succeeds or fails. But this, the Buddha taught, is a construction, a story the mind tells itself. And believing this story, identifying with this I, we create the very suffering we seek to escape. The self is a cage, the most fundamental cage of all. Now you might be wondering, if the self is an illusion, if it's a cage, then who is trapped? Who is seeking freedom? These are not philosophical puzzles, but living koans, questions that only reveal their answers through direct experience. What we have traced in this act are the various architects of the invisible prison. Psychology showed us the internal structures, neuroscience revealed the material substrate. Philosophy and spirituality pointed to the ultimate nature of the cage, but knowing the architecture is not the same as experiencing it. Understanding how a cage is built is not the same as being locked inside one, and so we must now descend deeper. We must move from theory to experience, from understanding to encounter. We must explore what it actually feels like when the mind becomes a cage, the lived experience of psychological imprisonment, the moment-to-moment reality of being trapped inside your own consciousness. The origins have been mapped, the blueprints have been examined. Now we must walk through the doors of the cage itself and confront what lives there. Are you ready? Then let us descend into the darkness. Listen. Can you hear it? That voice in your head right now, the one that's been narrating this entire experience, commenting on what you're hearing, judging whether this is useful or profound or a waste of time, worrying about the things you need to do later, replaying something embarrassing you said 3 days ago. That voice, that relentless, tireless, often cruel voice, that is the sound of the cage. It never stops, does it? Even when you sleep, it continues in dreams. Even in moments of beauty or joy, it's there, a step behind, commenting, "This is nice. Don't forget to take a picture. It won't last. Remember that time it didn't work out." The voice that turns every moment into a problem to be solved, every experience into a performance to be evaluated, every silence into a void to be filled with worry. Welcome to the interior of the cage. Welcome to the lived experience of mental imprisonment. For most people, most of the time, this imprisonment is so familiar it's invisible. You don't realize you're trapped because you've never known anything else. Like Plato's prisoners staring at shadows, you believe this is simply what consciousness is. This constant churning of thoughts, this ceaseless evaluation and judgment, this sense of being simultaneously actor, director, and critic in a play that never ends. But then something happens. Something breaks. Maybe it's a loss, a death, a betrayal, a failure so complete it shatters your sense of who you are. Maybe it's success that, when finally achieved, tastes like ash. Maybe it's simply the accumulation of years lived in quiet desperation until one morning you wake up and cannot get out of bed because the weight of continuing to pretend everything is fine has become unbearable. This is the moment when the cage becomes visible, when the bars previously invisible in their familiarity suddenly appear in stark relief, when you realize, with horror and fascination, that you have been living in a prison of your own making. Let me tell you about Marcus. Marcus is 37 years old. He has a good job, better than good actually. Senior management at a tech company. Good salary, nice apartment, gym membership he uses 3 times a week. From the outside, Marcus has achieved what he was supposed to achieve. He followed the blueprint. Good grades, prestigious university, career advancement, all the markers of success. But Marcus has a secret. Actually, he has several secrets, but they all point to the same truth. He is dying inside. Every morning, Marcus wakes up at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before his alarm, his heart already racing. The anxiety hits before consciousness fully returns, a familiar dread that permeates everything. He lies there, trying to breathe, while his mind begins its morning ritual, rehearsing today's meetings, anticipating problems, replaying yesterday's perceived failures. The voice in his head is brutal. You're a fraud. They're going to figure out you don't know what you're doing. That presentation last week was mediocre. Mike gave you that look. He knows you're not qualified. You're going to fail, and everyone will see. Marcus gets up. He goes through his morning routine with mechanical precision. Shower, coffee, check email. Each action is performed while a parallel process runs in his mind. Constant monitoring, constant judgment, constant anticipation of disaster. At work, Marcus is 2 people. There's the person everyone sees, confident, competent, engaged, and there's the person inside, terrified, exhausted, performing a role so perfectly that even he sometimes forgets it's a performance. He sits in meetings, nodding at appropriate moments, contributing ideas that sound intelligent. But inside, another meeting is happening. That was stupid. They think you're stupid. Why did you say that? Look at Jennifer's face. She thinks you're an idiot. Shut up. Stop talking. You're making it worse. By lunch, Marcus is exhausted from the work of being Marcus. He eats alone at his desk, scrolling through news he doesn't absorb, creating the appearance of busy productivity while actually hiding from the possibility of casual conversation, which might expose him, which might reveal the fraud. The afternoons are worse. The morning's adrenaline has worn off, leaving only a leaden fatigue. Marcus pushes through, drinking more coffee, forcing focus, maintaining the performance. But the voice is relentless. You're lazy. Everyone else is working harder. You're falling behind. You're going to lose this job. And then what? You'll end up alone, broke, a failure. Your parents were right to worry about you. Evening comes. Marcus leaves the office later than necessary, not because there's real work to do, but because going home means facing the emptiness. His apartment is clean, well furnished, objectively pleasant, but it feels like a cage. The silence there is too loud, filled with the roar of his own thoughts. He makes dinner, something healthy and joyless. He watches a show without watching it, his mind elsewhere, cycling through the day's interactions, finding new evidence of his inadequacy, building the case against himself. At night, lying in bed, Marcus faces the worst hours. This is when the voice drops its daytime pretense and reveals its true nature. This is when it stops criticizing his work performance and goes deeper to the existential questions. What is the point of your life? You're 37. And what have you actually accomplished? Where is the passion, the purpose, the meaning you thought you'd find by now? You're going to die someday, maybe in 40 years if you're lucky. And what will you have been? A worker bee who produced nothing of lasting value, who never took risks, who played it safe and ended up with nothing to show for it, but a retirement account and regrets. Marcus is not mentally ill, or rather, he is not diagnosably mentally ill. He doesn't meet the criteria for major depression or anxiety disorder, not quite, though he's close. He is simply a modern person living in the modern mind cage, the one built from achievement culture that measures worth by productivity and status, comparison culture amplified by social media that shows everyone else's highlight reel, disconnection from community, nature, meaning, purpose, the internalization of capitalism's logic that you are only as valuable as what you produce, the loss of rituals, of transcendence, of anything sacred, the speeding up of everything until there's no time to simply be. Marcus's cage is common. If you're honest, you recognize it. Maybe not in every detail, but in essence. The performance of being okay while dying inside, the relentless self-criticism, the sense that you're missing something essential, but you can't name what. The exhaustion that comes not from physical exertion, but from the invisible labor of maintaining your psychological defenses. But let us go deeper still. Let us explore the actual mechanisms of the cage, how it operates, how it sustains itself, how it resists change. The first mechanism is identification. You have learned to identify with your thoughts. When a thought arises, I'm not good enough. You don't experience it as a thought, a mental event that appears and passes. You experience it as truth, as reality, as you. The thought says, I am not good enough, and you believe that you, the essential you, are not good enough. This is like watching a movie and forgetting you're in the audience. You become so absorbed in the story on screen that you forget you are separate from it. You cry when the character cries, fear when the character fears, believe you are the character. But you are not your thoughts. You are the awareness in which thoughts arise. This might sound like semantic philosophy, but it is actually the key to the cage. As long as you identify with your thoughts, you are trapped. When you can observe them, you are free. The second mechanism is resistance. The mind has learned that unpleasant experiences are dangerous and must be avoided. So when pain arises, physical, emotional, psychological, the mind immediately resists. It contracts, it fights, it tries to push the pain away. But here is the paradox. The resistance to pain creates more suffering than the pain itself. The pain is a sensation, an experience that arises and passes. The resistance is a second layer, a mental struggle that amplifies and perpetuates the original pain. The Buddhist teacher Shinzen Young puts it simply, suffering, pain, resistance. The pain is unavoidable, it's part of being alive. But the suffering is optional. It's what happens when we resist the pain. Yet the mind has been trained to resist. From childhood, you learn to avoid discomfort, to seek pleasure, to protect yourself. These strategies worked, to a point, but they also built the cage. Because what cannot be felt cannot be healed. What is pushed away remains, lurking in the shadow, growing stronger in the darkness. The third mechanism is narrative. The mind is a story-making machine. It takes the raw data of experience and weaves it into narratives. This happened because I'm unlucky. That person treated me that way because I'm unlovable. I failed because I'm not smart enough. These stories feel true. They feel like accurate descriptions of reality, but they are interpretations, constructions, filters. And once a narrative is established, the mind finds evidence to support it and ignores evidence that contradicts it. This is confirmation bias, and it turns your beliefs into self-fulfilling prophecies. If you believe you are unlovable, you will unconsciously behave in ways that push people away, and when they leave, you will tell yourself, "See, I knew I was unlovable." The cage reinforces itself. The fourth mechanism is repetition. The brain, as we learned in Act 1, strengthens the pathways that are used most frequently. If you practice anxiety, you get better at anxiety. If you rehearse self-criticism, you become an expert self-critic. The patterns you repeat become the structures you inhabit. This is why simply understanding your cage doesn't free you from it. Marcus could read every psychology book ever written, could understand intellectually that his self-criticism is learned and unfounded, but it wouldn't change the patterns. Knowledge alone is not transformation. The cage must be dismantled through practice, through repeated new experiences that create new neural pathways. Now let us explore the varieties of cages, the different forms mental imprisonment takes. There is the cage of anxiety, a mind trapped in the future, endlessly catastrophizing, spinning scenarios of disaster that haven't happened and likely never will. The anxious mind cannot rest in the present because it is constantly vigilant for threats, constantly preparing for danger, constantly in fight or flight mode, even when there is nothing to fight or flee from. There is the cage of depression, a mind trapped in the past, endlessly replaying losses, failures, shame. The depressed mind cannot imagine a future because the present feels so heavy, so grey, so drained of possibility that the idea of tomorrow brings not hope, but only the dread of more of the same. There is the cage of obsessive thinking, a mind trapped in loops, unable to let go of certain thoughts, forced to repeat certain rituals or mental routines to manage the anxiety that arises when the rituals are interrupted. The OCD mind knows the rituals are irrational, but cannot stop performing them because the anxiety of stopping is unbearable. There is the cage of trauma, a mind trapped in a moment of horror that is always happening, always present, even when years have passed. The traumatized mind cannot distinguish between past and present, between memory and reality. A sound, a smell, a sensation can trigger a complete return to the traumatic event with all its terror and helplessness. There is the cage of addiction, a mind trapped in craving, unable to resist the pull of a substance or behavior despite knowing it causes harm. The addicted mind has learned that pain can be temporarily escaped through the drug, the drink, the screen, the food, the shopping, the sex. And though the escape is brief and followed by worse pain, the pattern repeats because the cage of craving is stronger than the will to change. There is the cage of perfectionism, a mind trapped in impossible standards, always striving, never satisfied, because satisfaction would mean stopping, and stopping would mean confronting the emptiness beneath the striving. The perfectionist mind believes it is pursuing excellence, but actually it is running from the terror of being average, ordinary, flawed. There is the cage of people-pleasing, a mind trapped in the needs and expectations of others, unable to access its own desires, unable to say no, unable to prioritize itself because its sense of worth depends entirely on external approval. The people-pleasing mind has forgotten how to feel its own feelings because it's too busy managing everyone else's. Each of these cages has its own internal logic, its own architecture, its own mechanisms of self-perpetuation. But they share common features. They all involve some form of resistance to present reality. They all involve identification with thought patterns. They all involve being trapped in time, either past or future rather than present. They all involve a fundamental disconnection from the body, from immediate sensory experience, from the simple fact of being alive right now. Let us now explore what happens when the cage becomes unbearable, when the conflict reaches its peak, when something must break. This is what the spiritual traditions call the dark night of the soul, what psychology calls ego death or psychological disintegration, what ordinary language calls nervous breakdown or falling apart. It feels like madness. It feels like dying. And in a sense, it is both. Imagine Emma. She is 42 years old. She has spent her entire adult life building a life that looks good from the outside. Marriage, children, career, house in the suburbs. She has performed the role of good wife, good mother, good employee, good daughter with such dedication that she has lost track of who she is beneath the performance. Then one day, something shifts. Maybe it's triggered by something specific. Her youngest child leaving for college, an affair discovered, a health scare. Or maybe it's nothing specific, just the slow accumulation of years of self-abandonment reaching a critical mass. Emma finds herself unable to get out of bed, not because she's tired, though she is exhausted, but because she can no longer remember why she should. The routines that have structured her life suddenly feel absurd, meaningless, impossible to continue. She looks at her life and sees a stranger's life. Who is this woman? What does she actually want? What does she believe? She realizes she has no idea. She has spent so long being what others needed her to be that she has forgotten, or perhaps never learned, who she is. This is terrifying, because if you are not the role you've been playing, then who are you? If you take off all the masks, what face lies beneath? Maybe nothing. Maybe emptiness. Maybe the self you've been so carefully maintaining doesn't actually exist. This is ego death. Not physical death, but the death of the psychological construct you've been calling I. The death of the story you've been telling yourself about who you are. And this death feels like annihilation. The mind, whose job is to maintain continuity and coherence, panics. It produces overwhelming anxiety, existential dread, dissociation. Emma experiences waves of pure terror, panic attacks that come out of nowhere, a sense that she is dissolving, fragmenting, going insane. Her family doesn't understand. They see her falling apart, and they're frightened. What's wrong with you? You have everything. Why are you doing this? You need to pull yourself together. But Emma can't pull herself together because the self she's supposed to pull together no longer exists. Or perhaps never existed. This is the darkest hour, the moment when the cage becomes visible in its totality, when you see how completely you've been trapped, and the seeing itself is overwhelming because you don't know how to exist without the cage. The cage has been your identity, your security, your reality, and now it's collapsing. What happens next is crucial. This is the crossroads. One path leads to breakdown, to prolonged dysfunction, to clinical depression, to medicalization and suppression of symptoms. This is the path of trying to rebuild the cage, to restore the old structure, to get back to normal. But there is another path. This one leads through the breakdown to breakthrough. It recognizes that the collapse is not a malfunction but a transformation. That ego death is not the end, but the beginning of something new. Carl Jung called this the process of individuation, the breaking down of the false self to allow the true self to emerge. The mystics called it the death of the ego and the birth of spiritual awakening. The shamanic traditions called it the initiatory crisis, the wound that becomes the source of healing. But walking this path requires something difficult. It requires not running from the darkness but entering it fully. It requires staying present to the fear, the uncertainty, the emptiness. It requires, paradoxically, surrendering the very thing you've been trying to control, yourself, your life, your reality. This surrender is not defeat. It's not giving up. It's something far more subtle and difficult. It's the recognition that you were never in control to begin with, that the self you were trying to maintain was a fiction, that the cage you were living in was built from assumptions and beliefs that you can now question. Let us return to Emma. She is in free fall. Everything she thought she knew has dissolved. She cannot go back to her old life because that would be living a lie. But she doesn't know what lies ahead. Here, in this impossible space, something begins to happen. Small moments of clarity appear in the darkness. In the midst of her anxiety, she notices her breath. In the midst of her confusion, she feels sunlight on her skin. In the midst of her existential terror, she hears birdsong and realizes with surprise that she's still alive, still sensing, still here. These moments are tiny, easy to miss, but they are crucial because they point to something that exists beneath the cage, beneath the story, beneath the self-concept. They point to awareness itself, the bare fact of consciousness, the simple presence that witnesses all experience, but is not itself any particular experience. This awareness has been here all along, but it was obscured by the noise of the mind, the constant churning of thoughts and emotions, the endless doing and becoming. Now, in the collapse of the ego structure, there is space for this awareness to reveal itself. Emma begins to notice that she is not her thoughts. She watches thoughts arise. I'm a failure. I'm broken. I'm going crazy. And instead of believing them, she sees them as events in consciousness, clouds passing through the sky of awareness. She begins to notice that she is not her emotions. She feels fear, grief, anger, but she also notices that she is the space in which these emotions appear. They are intense, yes, but they also pass, they change, they are not solid or permanent. She begins to notice that she is not her roles. She is not just a mother or a wife or a professional. These are functions she performs, but they are not the totality of who she is. Beneath all roles, there is something unconditioned, something free. This is the beginning of the awakening. Not a complete awakening, that may take years or lifetimes, but the first crack in the cage, the first glimpse of light. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We are still in Act 2, still in the darkness, still exploring the cage. The breakthrough comes later. For now, we must sit with the discomfort, the not knowing, the void. Because this is where most people get stuck. They reach the edge of ego death and they pull back, terrified. They medicate the symptoms, distract themselves, rebuild the cage in slightly modified form. They return to the familiar suffering because it's better than the unknown. And this is understandable. The unknown is terrifying. Ego death feels like actual death. The mind, evolved to keep you alive, cannot distinguish between psychological disintegration and physical destruction. It sounds the alarm: danger, retreat, survive. But here is what the wisdom traditions have always known: you must die to be reborn. The caterpillar must dissolve in the cocoon to become the butterfly. The seed must break open in the darkness of the soil to become the tree. The self you have been must die for the self you are becoming to emerge. This is not a metaphor. This is the actual psychological and neurological process of transformation. The old patterns must be disrupted, deconstructed, broken down. And this process is painful. It involves grief. Grief for the illusions you must let go of. Grief for the safety of the cage, even though the cage was also a prison. In the Eastern traditions, particularly in Buddhism and Vedanta, they speak of the gateless gate, the paradox that there is nowhere to go and nothing to achieve because you already are what you are seeking. The cage is an illusion. Freedom is your nature, but you cannot think your way to this realization. You must experience it directly, and that requires surrendering the very mechanism, the ego mind, that has been searching for freedom. In the Western mystical traditions, Christian contemplatives, Sufis, Kabbalists, they speak of the cloud of unknowing, the dark night of the soul, the necessity of dwelling in emptiness and uncertainty as a prerequisite for divine union or enlightenment. The language differs, but the truth is the same. Liberation requires descent. Awakening requires crisis. The breakthrough comes through the breakdown. We have explored the interior of the cage, the lived experience of mental imprisonment, the mechanisms that sustain it, the varieties it takes, and the crisis that occurs when it becomes unsustainable. We have sat with Marcus in his anxiety, with Emma in her ego death, with the countless others whose stories echo in your own life. But we have not yet found the exit. We have not yet discovered how the cage is unlocked. That comes next, in Act 3, in the awakening. But before we can move toward the light, we must fully honor the darkness. We must acknowledge that the cage is real, that the suffering is real, that the fear is real. And we must recognize that you cannot think your way out of a cage that is made of thought itself. The mind cannot solve the problem of the mind. The ego cannot transcend the ego. The self cannot free itself from the self. This is the final paradox of Act 2, the impossible knot that seems to have no solution. Hold this tension. Sit with this impossibility. Feel the frustration, the helplessness, the urge to escape or give up. Because it is precisely here, in this impossible place, that transformation becomes possible. When you finally stop trying to escape, when you finally surrender the futile effort to think your way out, when you finally allow yourself to fully be where you are, trapped, confused, broken, something shifts. Not because you did anything, but because you stopped doing. This is the threshold. the point of maximum crisis, the moment before dawn when the darkness is deepest. Are you still with me? Can you feel it? The pressure, the intensity, the sense that something is about to break? Good. Then let us cross the threshold together. Let us move from darkness toward light, from imprisonment toward freedom, from ego death toward awakening. There is a moment, and you will know it when it comes, when everything changes. It doesn't announce itself with trumpets or cosmic light shows. It comes quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the first lightening of the sky before dawn. You might miss it if you're not paying attention, but once it happens, once you see it, you cannot unsee it. This moment is the awakening, not a complete permanent enlightenment that may or may not come, but a shift in perspective, a crack in the cage, a glimpse of freedom that changes everything because it reveals what has always been true. The cage door was never locked. You were always free to leave. You just couldn't see it because you were looking in the wrong direction. Let us explore how this awakening happens, what it reveals, and how it transforms the architecture of consciousness. But first, a warning. What I'm about to describe is not a technique or a method or a 5-step program. It is not something you can force or achieve or accomplish. The ego loves methods and techniques because they give it something to do, some way to maintain control. But awakening is not about doing more. It's about doing less. It's about stopping. Remember Emma, whom we left at the edge of the abyss, in the depths of ego death? Let us return to her. She has been in this state for weeks now, unable to function as she once did, unable to perform the roles that once defined her, unable to believe the stories she once told herself about who she was. Her family is worried. Her friends suggest therapy, meditation, medication, a vacation. Everyone has advice about how to fix her, how to help her return to normal. But Emma has reached a point beyond fixing. She has tried all the techniques. She has read the self-help books, practiced the breathing exercises, repeated the affirmations. Nothing works because she is trying to use thought to escape from thought, using the mind to solve the problem of the mind. Then one morning, she is sitting in her backyard. She's not meditating. She's too agitated for that. She's just sitting because she's exhausted from doing, from trying, from resisting. And in this moment of surrender, when she has finally stopped fighting, something happens. She notices a bird. That's all. Just a bird, singing in a tree. She has heard this bird 1,000 times before, but this time she actually hears it. Not the concept of birdsong, not the judgment, that's pretty, or I should be enjoying this. She hears the actual sound, immediate and direct, without the filter of thought. And in that moment, something extraordinary occurs. The voice in her head stops, just for a second, maybe less. But there is a gap, a space, a moment of pure presence where she is simply aware, aware of sound, aware of the morning air on her skin, aware of the sensation of sitting, aware of awareness itself. And in that gap, she sees it. She has been living in a thought-created reality, mistaking the mind's constant commentary for truth, its interpretations for reality, its narratives for facts. The bird didn't need her thoughts to sing. The morning didn't need her judgment to exist. Life was happening, fully, completely, whether she was narrating it or not. This might sound small, trivial even, a bird singing. But this small moment contains the entire key to freedom. What Emma discovered, what every person who awakens discovers, is this. You are not your thoughts. You are the awareness in which thoughts appear. This is not philosophy. This is direct, experiential truth. Right now, as you listen to these words, thoughts are arising in your mind. Maybe agreement, maybe skepticism, maybe wondering what's for dinner later. These thoughts appear and disappear. They come and go. But the awareness in which they appear, that is constant. That is always here. You can observe your thoughts, which means you cannot be your thoughts. The observer cannot be the observed. The witness cannot be the witnessed. This realization is the first key to unlocking the cage. For your entire life, you have been identified with the voice in your head, believing that you are your thoughts. When a thought says, "I'm not good enough," you believe you are not good enough. When a thought says, "I'm anxious," you believe you are anxious. When a thought says, "I'm failing," you believe you are failing. But these are just thoughts, mental events, neurological patterns, electrical activity in networks of neurons. They are not reality. They are not you. The great spiritual teacher Ramana Maharshi suggested a simple practice. Whenever a thought arises, ask, "To whom does this thought appear?" The answer will always be, "To me." Then ask, "Who am I?" And in this inquiry, something shifts. You begin to locate yourself not in the thought, but in the awareness that witnesses the thought. This is not about suppressing thoughts or stopping them. You can't. The mind produces thoughts like the heart produces heartbeats. That's its function. But you can change your relationship to them. You can stop believing them. You can recognize them as phenomena appearing in consciousness rather than as truth-defining reality. Emma, sitting in her backyard, has her first glimpse of this. She realizes that for weeks she has been believing thoughts like, "I'm broken, and I'm going crazy, and I've ruined everything." But these were just thoughts, mental events, not facts about reality, but stories the mind was telling. And with this realization comes a profound sense of relief, not because her problems are solved, they're not. Not because she suddenly knows what to do with her life, she doesn't, but because she has found a tiny bit of space between herself and her suffering. She is no longer completely identified with the pain. She can witness it without being consumed by it. This is the beginning of freedom. But let us go deeper, because identifying with thoughts is only one bar of the cage. There are others. The second key is this: resistance is the source of suffering. Remember the equation: suffering, pain, x resistance. The pain, the actual sensations, emotions, experiences, is inevitable. You cannot go through life without encountering loss, failure, disappointment, physical pain, aging, death. These are part of the human condition. But the suffering, the mental torment, the psychological anguish, the sense of being trapped, this comes from resistance, from the mind's attempt to push away what is, to wish things were different, to fight against reality. A simple example: you stub your toe. There is pain, sharp, immediate, physical. But if you simply feel the pain without adding the story, "I'm so clumsy, I'm always hurting myself, this is terrible, it's going to ruin my day," the pain actually passes quite quickly. The body experiences it, the nervous system fires, and then it's over. But if you resist the pain, if you create a whole narrative around it, if you tense up and fight against the sensation, the suffering extends far beyond the physical pain. This applies to emotional pain even more powerfully. When grief arises, or anger, or fear, the immediate feeling is just energy in the body, sensations in the chest, the throat, the belly. These sensations are intense, but they are not unbearable. What makes them unbearable is the resistance. "I shouldn't feel this way. I need to stop feeling this. This feeling means something is wrong with me." The mystic poet Rumi wrote, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." He understood that what we resist, what we try to push away, actually contains the medicine we need. The shadow that Jung spoke of, the parts of ourselves we've exiled, these must be integrated, not eliminated. Emma begins to practice this. When anxiety arises, and it still does often, instead of trying to make it go away, instead of resisting it, she tries something different. She feels it. She locates the sensation in her body, the tightness in her chest, the flutter in her stomach, the racing of her heart. She breathes into these sensations, not to fix them, but to be with them. And a strange thing happens. When she stops resisting the anxiety, it begins to move. It intensifies for a moment, which is why resistance is so tempting. but then it peaks and begins to subside. Like a wave, it rises and falls. She discovers that emotions are not solid, permanent states, but dynamic processes that move through the body if we let them. This doesn't mean the anxiety disappears forever. It doesn't. But her relationship to it changes. It stops being an enemy to be fought and becomes simply a sensation to be experienced. It stops defining her and becomes just another weather pattern moving through the sky of consciousness. The third key is presence. Being here, now, in this moment, rather than lost in thoughts about the past or future. The cage exists in time. When you're trapped in the mind, you're either dwelling on the past, reliving shame, regret, resentment, or you're catastrophizing about the future, anticipating disaster, rehearsing failure. Either way, you're not here. You're not in the only moment that actually exists, now. And here's what's extraordinary about now. In this moment, as it actually is, there is no problem. I don't mean your life circumstances are perfect. I mean, right now, as you sit or stand or lie wherever you are, in this immediate present moment, are you okay? Is your body breathing? Is your heart beating? Can you see, hear, feel? The problems exist in thought, in time. I failed yesterday. I'm going to fail tomorrow. I'm not where I should be. These are all thoughts about time, but in the timeless present, there is just this, the aliveness of being, the simple fact of existence. This is what Eckhart Tolle calls the power of now, the recognition that the present moment is all there ever is. Past and future are mental constructs, useful for planning and learning, but not real in the way this moment is real. Emma learns to anchor herself in the present. When her mind starts spiraling into worry about the future or rumination about the past, she brings her attention back to immediate sensory experience. The feel of her feet on the ground, the sensation of breath, the sounds in the environment. These become anchors that pull her out of the time-based mental cage and into the timeless reality of now. And in this now, she begins to discover something unexpected, moments of peace. Not because her life has gotten easier. It hasn't. Not because she's solved her problems. She hasn't. But because she's found a place to stand that's outside the storm of thought, a dimension of being that's not touched by the mind's chaos. The fourth key is embodiment, returning to the body, to physical sensation, to the intelligence of the organism that exists beneath and before thought. One of the primary mechanisms of the cage is dissociation, disconnection from the body. When you live in your head, lost in thoughts and stories, you lose contact with the wisdom of the body, with its signals and its knowing. The body always knows the truth. If you're in a situation that's bad for you, the body knows. It creates tension, nausea, a sense of wrongness. But the mind overrides these signals. The mind says, I should be okay with this. Other people would be okay with this. I'm being too sensitive. And you disconnect from what you actually feel. Trauma, particularly, lives in the body. Bessel van der Kolk, one of the leading trauma researchers, titled his landmark book, The Body Keeps the Score, because he discovered that traumatic experiences leave imprints not just in memory, but in the body itself, in patterns of tension, in nervous system dysregulation, in the way trauma survivors hold themselves and move through space. Healing trauma and healing from the cage of the mind requires returning to the body. This is why somatic practices, yoga, dance, martial arts, body-centered psychotherapy, can be so powerful. They bring awareness back to physical sensation, back to the felt sense of being embodied. Emma begins moving her body in new ways, not exercise for weight loss or fitness. That's still a goal-oriented mind activity. But movement for the sake of feeling alive, for the sake of experiencing her body as a source of wisdom and pleasure rather than just a vehicle for her head. She discovers that grief lives in her chest, waiting to be felt and released. That anger lives in her jaw and shoulders, held in chronic tension. That fear lives in her belly, creating shallow breathing and constant vigilance. And as she brings gentle awareness to these places, as she breathes into them and moves them, something begins to shift. The frozen patterns start to thaw. The held emotions begin to move and release. She doesn't force this. Forcing is more of the cage. She simply creates space for it to happen. The fifth key, and perhaps the most challenging, is this. The self you've been trying to protect, improve, and perfect doesn't actually exist as a solid, independent thing. This is the deepest teaching of Buddhism, the realization that shattered the Buddha's cage 2,500 years ago. The self is not an entity, but a process, not a noun, but a verb. It is a continuous construction, a story the mind tells itself, a pattern of thoughts and sensations and memories that create the illusion of a separate I. Look for this self. Where is it? Is it in your body? But your body's cells are constantly dying and being replaced. The body you have now is not the body you had 7 years ago. Almost every cell has been replaced. Are you a different person? Is the self in your mind? But your thoughts are constantly changing. Your beliefs, your preferences, your sense of identity, these all shift over time. The you at age 7 believed different things than the you at age 17 or 27. Is the self in your memories? But memories are notoriously unreliable, constantly being reconstructed and modified by the present. And many of your experiences are forgotten entirely. Are those forgotten moments less you than the remembered ones? The more you look for a solid, permanent self, the more it dissolves into processes, into changing patterns, into a flowing river that creates the illusion of stability. This is not nihilism. You don't disappear when you realize the self is a construction. Rather, something more authentic appears. Instead of defending a fixed image of who you are, you can be flexible, fluid, responsive to life. Instead of trying to maintain a story about yourself, you can simply be. Emma has glimpses of this, moments when the question, "Who am I?" doesn't lead to answers, but to a kind of open awareness, a spaciousness that doesn't need to define itself. It's unsettling at first. The ego wants definition, wants to know who it is, but it's also liberating. If you're not a fixed self, you can't fail at being yourself. You can't be inadequate or unworthy because there's no solid thing to be inadequate or unworthy. You are not a thing. You are the happening of life, the process of consciousness unfolding, the dance of awareness exploring itself through this particular body and mind. The sixth key is surrender. Not defeat, not giving up, but a profound acceptance of what is. The cage persists as long as you're fighting against reality, trying to force life to be different than it is. This shouldn't be happening. I shouldn't feel this way. I should be different than I am. These thoughts create constant internal conflict. Surrender means dropping this fight. It means saying yes to what is, even when what is hurts, even when what is disappoints you, even when what is terrifies you. This doesn't mean you stop taking action or making changes. It means you start from acceptance of what is, rather than resistance to what is. You can't effectively change what you won't accept. As long as you're fighting against reality, all your energy goes into the fight rather than into effective response. Byron Katie, a teacher who had her own profound awakening, developed a practice called the work based on a simple insight. When you argue with reality, you lose, but only 100% of the time. Suffering comes from believing thoughts that oppose reality. He shouldn't have left me. I shouldn't have this illness. The world shouldn't be this way. But he did leave. You do have this illness. The world is this way. These are facts. The suffering comes from the mental argument with facts. Surrender doesn't mean liking what is or wanting what is. It means accepting what is as the starting point, as reality, and then responding from that acceptance rather than from resistance. Emma gradually learns this. She stops fighting against her situation. She stops trying to force herself back into her old life, her old self. She accepts, this is where I am. I don't know what comes next. I don't have answers. And that's okay. And in this acceptance, paradoxically, things begin to move, not back to the old patterns, but forward into something new. The seventh key is compassion, especially self-compassion, the voice that narrates your life, that judges and criticizes and finds you wanting. This voice learned its tone from somewhere, from parents, from teachers, from culture, from the internalized standards of a world that profits from your sense of inadequacy. But this voice is not truth, it's conditioning, and it can be changed. Imagine speaking to yourself the way a loving parent speaks to a beloved child, or the way a good friend speaks to someone they care about, with kindness, with understanding, with recognition of how hard you're trying, how much you're carrying, how brave it is just to keep going. Most people treat themselves with a harshness they would never direct at anyone they love. And this harshness is not motivating or helpful. It's just another bar of the cage. Self-compassion is not self-indulgence or self-pity. It's recognizing your shared humanity, your vulnerability, your inherent worthiness of care and kindness. It's understanding that you're doing your best with the tools and understanding you have, that you didn't choose your genetics or your early experiences, that you're not fundamentally flawed, but fundamentally human. Kristin Neff, a researcher who studies self-compassion, has found that it's more effective than self-esteem for psychological well-being. Self-esteem is contingent. It goes up when you succeed and down when you fail. But self-compassion is unconditional. It's there especially when you fail, when you're struggling, when you're hurting. Emma learns to notice the harsh voice and respond to it, not with more harshness, but with gentleness. When it says, "You're a failure," she might respond, internally, "You're really hurting right now. This is so hard. It's okay to struggle." This might seem trivial, but it's revolutionary. It breaks the cycle of self-attack. And in that break, healing becomes possible. The eighth key, and we're approaching the end now, is the recognition of interconnection. One of the fundamental aspects of the cage is the belief in separation. I am here and the world is there. I am isolated, alone, fundamentally separate from everyone and everything. But this is an illusion. You are not separate from nature. You are nature. Your body is made of the same elements as the stars. You breathe air that has circled the planet, that has been breathed by countless beings. You drink water that has moved through clouds and rivers and oceans for billions of years. You are not separate from other humans. Your consciousness, your sense of self, was formed in relationship. You exist in a web of connection, family, friends, community, culture, species. The boundaries between you and not you are porous, constructed, contextual. Modern physics supports this insight. Quantum mechanics reveals that at the deepest level, separation is illusory. Particles that have interacted remain entangled, influencing each other instantaneously across any distance. The observer and the observed are not separate, but part of a unified field of reality. Ancient wisdom traditions have always known this. Tattvam asi, say the Vedas. Thou art that. You are not separate from the universe. You are the universe experiencing itself through this particular form. When this truth is realized, not intellectually but experientially, the cage of isolation shatters. You realize you were never alone. You are part of a vast, interconnected web of being, a single note in an infinite symphony. Emma experiences this one day while walking in the woods. She looks at a tree and realizes that tree is breathing out oxygen that she is breathing in. She is breathing out carbon dioxide that the tree is breathing in. They are in constant exchange, constant relationship. The boundary between Emma and tree is arbitrary. They are one system, one living process. And in this moment, her sense of isolation, which has been one of her deepest sufferings, dissolves. She is not an isolated self trying to survive in a hostile world. She is an integral part of the whole, held by it, participating in it, inseparable from it. These 8 keys, awareness, non-resistance, presence, embodiment, no self, surrender, compassion, interconnection, are not sequential steps. They are different facets of the same diamond, different doors opening into the same space of freedom. And that space is not somewhere you arrive. It's not a state you achieve and then maintain. It's a dimension of being that's always available, always here, even in the midst of difficulty, even in the midst of the cage. Because here's the final twist. Even the cage is not what it seemed. The bars you've been pushing against are also consciousness. The prison is also the path. The suffering is also the teacher. Nothing needs to be rejected or escaped. Everything can be held in awareness, embraced in compassion, integrated into wholeness. This is what Jung meant by individuation, what Buddhists mean by enlightenment, what mystics mean by union with the divine. It's not a special state reserved for saints and sages. It's your natural condition, obscured by misunderstanding, by identification, by resistance. And awakening is not the acquisition of something new, but the recognition of what's always been true. You are not in the cage. You are the space in which the cage appears. You are not trapped by your thoughts. You are the awareness that witnesses thoughts. You are not the suffering. You are the consciousness that knows suffering, and also knows joy, knows peace, knows love. Let us return one final time to Emma. Months have passed since her collapse. From the outside, her life doesn't look dramatically different. She's still navigating the same challenges. But everything has changed because she has changed. She still experiences anxiety, but she no longer is the anxiety. She still has difficult days, but she doesn't make them mean something about her worth. She still doesn't have all the answers about what comes next, but she's learned to trust the not knowing. She has found the key to the cage. It was never about escaping her experience, but about changing her relationship to it. The freedom she sought was not somewhere else, some other state, some other life. It was in the simple, revolutionary act of being present to this moment, this breath, this life, exactly as it is. And in this presence, in this acceptance, in this surrender, something unexpected has emerged. Gratitude. Not despite the suffering, but because of it. Because the breakdown broke her open. Because ego death revealed what lies beyond ego. Because the cage, when fully explored, was found to have no walls. This is the awakening. Not perfect, not permanent, but real. A crack in the structure of consciousness through which light enters. A shift in perspective that cannot be unseen. And once you see it, once you realize that you've been free all along, that the mind's prison was a construction, that you are not your thoughts or your emotions or your story, but the vast awareness in which all of this appears, everything changes. Not because your problems disappear, they don't, but because you've discovered a dimension of being that's not touched by problems, a place to stand that's beyond the cage, a truth about yourself that no circumstance can diminish. You are not broken. You were never broken. You are consciousness itself, playing at being human, forgetting yourself in the game, and now, beautifully, painfully, remembering. This is the awakening. But awakening is not the end of the story. It's the beginning. We have traveled far together. From the comfortable ignorance of unconsciousness, through the historical origins of psychology's understanding of the mind, into the dark interior of the mental cage, through the crisis of ego death, and finally to the awakening, the recognition of freedom that was always here. But what happens next? What does this awakening mean, not just for you as an individual, but for humanity as a collective? What is the future of consciousness? We stand at a unique moment in human history. For the first time, ancient wisdom about the nature of mind and consciousness is being validated by modern neuroscience. For the first time, practices of meditation and mindfulness are being integrated into mainstream psychology and psychiatry. For the first time, technologies are emerging that may allow us to map consciousness in ways previously impossible. We are also creating artificial intelligence, algorithms and systems that seem to exhibit some form of intelligence, perhaps even some form of consciousness. This raises profound questions. What is consciousness? Is it unique to biological brains, or is it a more fundamental feature of information processing? As AI becomes more sophisticated, will it develop the kind of self-referential awareness that creates the human cage, or will it be free in ways we cannot imagine? Some theorists suggest we're approaching what they call the technological singularity, a point where artificial intelligence surpasses human intelligence and begins to evolve beyond our understanding. But perhaps an equally important singularity is happening within consciousness itself, a collective awakening, a species-wide recognition of the mechanisms of mental imprisonment and the possibility of freedom. Consider this. Every major crisis humanity faces, climate change, political polarization, economic inequality, mental health epidemics, is fundamentally a crisis of consciousness. These are not merely external problems to be solved with better technology or policies. They arise from the way humans think, perceive, and relate to reality. Climate change is driven by a consciousness that sees itself as separate from nature, that cannot feel the interconnection between human well-being and planetary well-being. Political polarization is driven by a consciousness that sees in binary oppositions, us versus them, right versus wrong, that cannot hold complexity or recognize shared humanity across difference. Economic inequality is driven by a consciousness that measures worth in material accumulation, that believes scarcity is fundamental, that cannot imagine abundance as a shared reality rather than a zero-sum competition. Mental health crises are driven by a consciousness that has lost touch with meaning, purpose, community, presence, that lives in the mental cage we've explored. These problems cannot be solved at the level of consciousness that created them. We cannot think our way out using the same patterns of thinking that got us in. We need, collectively, what individuals need: awakening, evolution of consciousness itself. And perhaps, this is already happening. Perhaps the widespread interest in mindfulness, meditation, psychedelics, contemplative practices is not a trend, but a transformation. Perhaps the breakdown of old structures, political, economic, religious, is creating space for something new to emerge. The mystics and visionaries have always spoken of a coming shift in human consciousness. Teilhard de Chardin called it the Omega Point, a convergence toward higher consciousness. Sri Aurobindo spoke of the supramental transformation of humanity. The New Age movement predicted an age of Aquarius, of elevated awareness. Whether these specific visions come true is less important than the underlying insight. Consciousness can evolve. Individually and collectively, we can wake up from the trance of identification, separation, resistance. We can learn to live from presence rather than from past and future. We can integrate our shadows rather than projecting them. We can recognize our interconnection rather than fighting to maintain illusory boundaries. But awakening, both individual and collective, is not a passive process. It requires courage. It requires willingness to let the cage collapse, to endure the discomfort of ego death, to sit with uncertainty and unknowing. It requires what the existentialists called authentic existence, the courage to be yourself rather than to perform roles, to face the anxiety of freedom rather than escape into conformity or addiction or distraction. It requires what the Buddhists call right effort, not the striving of the ego, but the sustained attention to awareness, to presence, to compassion. It requires ultimately a fundamental shift in identity, from "I am a separate self trying to survive and succeed in a hostile world," to "I am consciousness itself, experiencing life through this particular form, intimately connected to all that is." This shift doesn't solve all problems. Even awakened beings face challenges, make mistakes, experience pain. But they do so from a fundamentally different place, from presence rather than from reactivity, from acceptance rather than from resistance, from wholeness rather than from fragmentation. And as more individuals make this shift, something changes in the collective field. The patterns of consciousness that dominate our culture begin to shift. New possibilities emerge. What seemed impossible becomes possible. So what does this mean for you? for your life, your challenges, your cage. It means that wherever you are right now, whether you're at the beginning of recognizing your cage or deep in the crisis of ego death or experiencing moments of awakening, you are exactly where you need to be. The journey unfolds at its own pace. There is no schedule, no achievement, no arrival. It means that the suffering you've experienced, the anxiety, the depression, the sense of being trapped, was not meaningless. It was the signal that something needed to change, the pressure that would eventually break the cage. It means that you don't need to become someone else or achieve some special state to be free. You simply need to recognize what's already true, that you are not your thoughts, that you are not your story, that you are the awareness in which all experience appears. And it means that your awakening matters, not just for you, but for all of us. Because consciousness is not truly individual. We're all swimming in the same ocean of awareness, breathing the same atmosphere of collective consciousness. When you wake up, you make it easier for others to wake up. When you break free from your cage, you weaken the cages that hold everyone. This is not mystical thinking. This is systems theory. Every element in a complex system affects every other element. Your thoughts, your emotions, your state of consciousness ripple out through your interactions, your relationships, your culture. Let me leave you with a final image. Imagine humanity as a single organism that's been asleep, dreaming nightmares of separation, conflict, and suffering. And imagine that each individual awakening is like a single cell of this organism waking up, remembering its true nature, recognizing its connection to the whole. For a long time, only a few cells were awake, the mystics, the sages, the prophets. But now more and more cells are awakening, and there may come a moment, perhaps in our lifetimes, perhaps not, when enough cells are awake that the entire organism shifts. When humanity as a whole recognizes what individuals are recognizing, that we are one consciousness exploring itself through billions of forms, that separation is illusion, that love is our nature. This is not guaranteed. Evolution does not promise happy endings. Consciousness could continue to build more sophisticated cages, more elaborate prisons, or we could destroy ourselves before we awaken fully. But there is another possibility, and that possibility begins with you, with your willingness to look at your own cage honestly, with your courage to sit with the discomfort of awakening, with your commitment to presence, to awareness, to compassion, for yourself and for all beings. The mind does not have to be a cage. It can be a doorway, a window, a space of infinite possibility. You are not trapped. You never were. The key was always in your hand. All you have to do is turn it. And now, as we come to the end of this journey, I want to thank you for your attention, for your willingness to descend into these depths, for your courage in facing what faces you. Remember, awakening is not a destination, but a direction. Every moment offers the opportunity to choose awareness over unconsciousness, presence over distraction, compassion over judgment. The cage may return, the old patterns may reassert themselves. This is normal. This is the process. Be patient with yourself, be gentle, keep returning to the present moment. Keep recognizing thoughts as thoughts rather than as truth. Keep feeling rather than resisting. Keep opening rather than closing. And know this, you are not alone. We are all in this together, all struggling with our cages, all seeking freedom, all part of the same great awakening of consciousness that is unfolding through our species. The future of consciousness is being written now, in this moment, by every choice you make to be present or to be lost in thought, to be aware or to be asleep, to be free or to remain trapped. Choose freedom. Choose awareness. Choose presence, not as a permanent achievement, but as a moment-by-moment practice, a lifetime's work, a sacred journey. The mind that was a cage can become a garden. The prison can become a palace. The darkness can birth the light. This is your invitation. This is your inheritance. This is your truth. You are free. You have always been free. and now, finally, beautifully, you know it. Thank you for accompanying me on this journey through the labyrinth of consciousness. May you find the door to your cage wide open, and may you walk through it into the freedom that is your birthright.